All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to today. Thanks for taking a week off with us. We are attempting to do a workout, and I'm going to talk about that really quick before we get going. We'd like to incorporate an additional aspect to this, and that's to do some actual training where I will lead said training. And for those who can participate in the training. And Roger will be having a coach's eye and possibly a couple other people to kind of help with coaching in some of the areas of it. For this, we'd like to start it in our head. We kind of thought about Saturday mornings. I know that may not work for everybody. So after this, if you have like a preferred day, let me know. All things will be considered. But we would like to get that going on a regular basis as well. Now, as for that, we would like, this is a donation type thing. So if you want to continue to donate, fantastic. If you want to start, even better. If you don't, that's fine too. But we would like to charge $5 for the actual workout and coaching in action session. Okay. So hopefully that's something you all want to do. We think it'll be fantastic to reinforce these skills that we talk about, as well as help you become better with the kettlebell and ultimately accomplish all the great things that you want to and earn said barley water afterwards. That being said, I'm going to take this over to Roger. He's going to talk about some really great stuff today. And again, I'm going to demonstrate how to apply that after he's through. And if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and let us know. But other than that, I'm gonna mute you all, except for I will unmute Roger here. Hey, Christian, welcome.
What's that?
Oops. 1 second. All right. Cool. All right, Roger, go ahead and give it a go.
All right. Let me get everyone's faces out of. All right. Let me get everyone's faces out of my way. All right. So today we want to talk about joint variability, which can get a little complex. It isn't necessarily. What we really want to talk about is using the entire kettlebell system. Not just using the kettlebell system, but using it properly. And we're going to talk about what we think that means. We're looking for balance in this situation, but before we get to that, we want to talk about a few. Hey, oh, I forgot to reorder the slides. This is supposed to be the first one. Joint variability. What does that mean? Do your joints have the ability to go through all of their ranges of motion, as much range of motion as possible? Is it necessarily a good thing? It's not always going to be. And, before we really get too far into this, I want everyone to think that, being able to do as much as possible is not always in line with your goals. I'm not going to say it's less healthy. There are some points, which a joint having more range of motion will actually be stronger and get you to your goals. But when you get into extremes of training, let's say powerlifting, for example, powerlifting very different than Olympic lifting. A lot of these people are really training for 3 different positions, and their joints will accommodate to those positions. Increasing variability for a powerlifter in a lot of cases is going to be bad. It's going to take a lot of time and training away from what their actual goal is. It may even have an adverse effect on their ability to create joint stiffness. So, you want to keep in mind that performance and joint variability often have an inverse relationship. As you perform better and you specialize in particular motions, usually your ability to move in other ways is diminished. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind when we talk about variability. So the stuff we're talking about should be considered if it's relevant to your goal. Don't just assume that it is, because it may not be. Also, don't assume that variability is necessarily a good thing. I would argue that it is, but it is still an argument, and I don't think we can necessarily conclude that it is based on a lot of the available information. So we want to talk about perspective. It's pretty big in the fitness industry, probably has in the last, let's say, 5-10 years, where everything's about balance. doing isolation, bodybuilding, whatever you want to call it, has kind of fallen out of favor. And now everyone's talking about things like, I got to balance my pushes and my pulls. And if I do this, I've got to do that. I don't do total body, or I don't do isolation. I do total body because I'm not a caveman. That's all well and good. And I think that's a fine, I think that's a fine perspective. But just because you do different movements does not necessarily mean your joints are experiencing different sensations. So a movement-oriented approach would be, I did some squatting, now I'm going to do some hinging, and vice versa. I want everyone to think about a movement quality oriented position, and really what that's going to be is, what are the joints experiencing? So we're going to go through some different examples with exercises, but just because you perform an exercise does not necessarily mean your joints are experiencing the difference. And we'll get into some slides a little bit later that are going to illustrate that. But the point is, we want to not only, we want to, if you're going for variability, yes, you want to mix up your exercises, but it's really important that you exercise in the proper way, if that's really what you're after. We're going to talk about what that actually means. So, movement focus, it just assumes that doing, let's say, like I said, a squat and doing a hinge are going to get you two different things. They may not. The perspective is, the problem with the perspective is that you may be training the same position, just in slightly different ways. You're not really getting what you want. Movement quality focus examines joint position, speed. We talked a little bit about this in some of the other seminars, but you're really looking specifically at the joint level and joint motion. So in this case, how a movement is done is as important as which movement is done. Okay. So we're going to really look at joint position, not necessarily not necessarily a movement or an exercise-based perspective. Okay. So we're going to use the examples of the innominate. If you guys have questions about this, these terms are pretty simple, but it basically just means the big wing bones around your sacrum, part of your pelvis. We're going to use those. We're going to use your scapula. Those are going to be our examples. And the reason why they're going to be our examples is because they have similar shapes, okay? And they have kind of a similar orientation in the body, where you have lots of different muscles that are pulling on them. Another interesting thing about these particular bones is how they are moved or not moved is going to directly influence the amount of motion that is available at a joint. And we're not going to get too deep into a lot of this stuff because we only have, whatever's left of my time to talk. But if the innominate bones or if the scapula are in a particular position, it is going to directly influence your range of motion. So what I'm going to assert is that those bones need to move if you are actually going to be training joint variability. These bones will allow movement even though they may not be near their anatomical home, and that's kind of important. That's kind of an important concept to keep in mind as we go through this. Do you have any questions about this stuff so far? It's kind of a simple concept, but it was something that was really missing from my training for a long, long time. The idea of just doing a movement doesn't necessarily mean you're getting the outcome you want. So let's get into a little bit of basic pelvic mechanics. So nutation and counter nutation are really things that the sacrum will do. We're going to talk, I'm going to kind of step on the terminology here just for the sake of convenience. The sacrum and the innominants are going to have movements relative to one another, but the overall motion of everything is usually combined when we get into real world practical mechanics. So a nutated pelvis is associated with the pelvis moving forward into an anterior tilt. Tilts are defined by the top. So if you can see my little pointer here, tilts are usually defined by the top of the structure. So if this structure here, which is representative of the pelvis, comes forward or anterior, that would be an anterior tilt. If it moves backward, it would be a posterior tilt. So nutation and counter nutation are what happens at the pelvis, and these have relationships. And influences with the hip sockets. So here's an acetabulum here. So here's your hip socket. Here's the head of the femur. Okay. and here's the shaft. This is the bone here. This is adapted from something else we're working on, kind of a big, nasty swing presentation. But what I want to point out is as this top of the pelvis rotates forward, as in the picture on the right here, the bone here, this hip joint is going to, it's going to be in a position of flexion. When this point and this point come together, this joint experiences flexion. Now, if we're walking around in this position all the time, this joint is always in flexion. That's what it recognizes, that's what it knows. So when you see like all the pretty people on Instagram doing their squats, you know, with you know, their pelvis kind of blown out, they usually do squats in a position of nutation. So they do squats in a position of anterior tilt. They usually have their legs really, really far apart. What happens is this joint does not actually get any variability. That in one case, you're seeing a squat, or let's say you're seeing a deadlift or a hinge, and the proper association should be nutation. This should come forward. That, you know, when you're going down and when you're coming up, that's exactly what should happen. But with people who don't have real joint variability, when they're squatting without dropping the pelvis straight down, without allowing the pelvis to counter nutate, or this triangle move to move backwards, okay? All of this stuff in this joint, all of this here is not actually moving. What you're doing is you're hinging with your knees bent more. So it's kind of like the difference in many cases between a conventional deadlift and a straight-legged deadlift, okay? The joints themselves are not experiencing change. And that's really, really important, especially when we get into swings later. You know, Jeremiah's gonna do some demonstrating. But this on the right, this is not a hip that knows how to flex. If someone is living in this position, they're not going to get great hip flexion. And as a result, they're not going to get good hip extension. So when we go back to the swing seminar, these are the people who are going to do a lot of hinging through their spine. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Yes, I do have a question. Just recently, it may have been a week or two ago, I saw this may be an extreme example, but let's say I saw LeBron James, right? And he was actually being trained to do squats in that anterior tilt. And like in that, I saw like he had like some extreme rib flare in doing so. So I was wondering, is there any benefit in actually training like that?
You know, that the terms like benefit are a little tricky. So if me looking at LeBron James just as a normal human, I've looked at his form, I look at his training, and part of it's horrifying. Part of it's like, that's not a good idea. You know, he is not in a position to really breathe all that well. He's not in a position to have lots and lots of motion available to him. But the fact remains, you know, I do my best to avoid watching sports, but what people insist upon telling me is that he's really good. So if I'm training that guy, I'm probably not messing with things. I'm making sure that he's resilient in the position he's in. So I wouldn't just assume that, you know, his trainer is training him. His trainer may just be training him in the position where he is. You know, when you take a high level athlete and, you know, you try to take them out of position. I mean, this is a guy who's won, you know, who makes millions of dollars a year, has won lots of titles. If I'm his trainer and I like, oh, we need to get your ribs down. Like, you should hit me in the head with a hammer because I'm clearly a stupid person and don't deserve to live. So you need to train people where they are. Could there be some benefit? Maybe, you know, that's just his particular position, but that is not anatomy. That's not how anatomy works. You know, there may be something specific going on, but the short answer is we don't have enough information, but probably not. His trainer is just probably training him the way he thinks. There's also an old school way of thinking, especially with strength coaches, where they really train that kind of hard arch, and they think that, you know, every movement should have a lot of lumbar extension because it's protective of the back. As a fitness industry, we're really anti-flexion because we think our spines are going to explode. So his coach may actually think he's doing him a favor, or his trainer. I really don't know, is the short answer. But from a joint variability standpoint, I can say definitively that his trainer's not doing him any favors. He's not going to unlock more motion. He's going to continue to restrict motion. And if he doesn't have the current motion available, then, you know, he is going to eventually get some sort of injury. But again, I wouldn't advocate for doing anything different. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on. So, you know, now we've got the whole, so what, like when we get into, you know, we get into some of these positions, why does it matter? Why do we want to change things? You know, if you're really looking at having the ability to work through the entire kettlebell system, which I would advocate you probably should. It's a good system. It really trains a lot of different motions. Your swings are going to be less good if you are stuck in a nutated position. Your body is going to adapt to a position of less variability, and that doesn't mean that you won't be able to perform. You know, going through strong first and athletes in general, they're really great at compensating. So, you know, this may not always be the right thing, but if you're looking for a little bit of extra, let's say you're in pain and you want to get out of pain, or if you're looking for a little extra performance and your goal allows it, then you probably should get out of that position just so you have the ability to perform better, because better hip flexion will lead to better hip extension, and there's no question about that. So again, we want to think about the way we're doing the movement rather than the movement we're doing, because you know, with these people, if they're doing a squat but they're in that nutated position, they're just squatting twice, or they're hinging twice rather, and the opposite could be true, but it isn't usually. So as an exercise example, now most people who are familiar with the FMS system especially will be familiar with the active straight leg raise. And the active straight leg raise is this whole mobility thing that gets you looser. It improves your flexibility, which probably is not true even a little bit, but that's a different topic. But the assumption usually comes from the fact that the hamstrings are feeling tight because there's some sort of length discrepancy. And what I would say is let's go back to this slide, maybe just to illustrate it. So someone who has a nutated pelvis, so imagine we see this triangle here at the top, and at the bottom of the pelvis, we're gonna have these ischial tuberosities, which is where the hamstrings are gonna attach, okay? And the hamstrings are gonna go down and they're gonna attach to the knee, and you're gonna have this nice long line here. As this thing chronically dumps forward, the ischial tuberosity is gonna go from, let's say, right around here, it's gonna live up here. Okay, it is chronically going to be farther away from the ground than it normally is. Things are going to feel tight. So just getting someone into an active straight leg raise isn't necessarily going to fix that problem. If you don't reorient the pelvis, you're not actually fixing the thing that is making the hamstrings feel tight. So in my experience, what works much better is to actually do a deep squat. I make sure that the knees come forward and make sure that I sit down directly between my feet. I get my pelvis in a different position, and it has never been the case where I have not, with myself or someone else, I have not seen more range of motion on the active straight leg raise, because I'm giving someone their bony alignment back to a degree. I'm allowing the hamstrings to relax. And once you do that, then I'll bring them back through the active straight leg raise, and I will see an improved range of motion. Okay, so you can either, if you are going to do your active straight leg raise, do some squatting first to do it properly. If not, then you don't need to do it. Just do squats properly. Don't hinge in your squat, and you probably won't really need to do these things. Any questions on that? All right. If you guys think of questions, don't be afraid to stop me. We talked a little bit about this in the press. So generally, pulling forces, rows, kettlebell ballistics, you've got to control the shoulders in your back. They encourage the scaps to become retracted, depressed, and downwardly rotated. Okay, that is just what those forces do. Nothing wrong with that. There could potentially be a problem with it though when they get stuck there. So pushing forces should be able to do the opposite, where you have you're going to be able to get in some elevation, some upward rotation, and a little bit of protraction. That's what the scap should normally do when you go overhead. I mentioned this a little bit before, but the problem comes when people are continually packing the shoulders and keeping everything down and back when they're doing all pushing motions, whether they're doing push-ups, they're doing overhead presses. Again, the scapula will influence the glenohumeral joint, and you will have limitations in range of motion, which is why you see a lot of really big, strong people unable to get their arms overhead. because they have so much compression on the backside of their bodies. They are so downwardly rotated and retracted that they just really have nowhere to go. And I didn't have time to do too much of a fancy drawing for this one. I did a little bit, but I'll get to that in a sec. So just the idea of glenohumeral rhythm. If you guys don't know what that is, you should probably look it up. It's just a simple anatomical reality. You know, so when you have two degrees of shoulder flexion, for every 2 degrees, you should have 1 degree at the scap. So your scap needs to come forward in the scapular plane. It needs to rotate in that upward rotation in order to have full motion to the shoulder. If not, you've got, you know, if you do the math, you've got about 60 degrees you've got to come up with. And usually people are going to come up with it either through laxity of the ligament. You'll see a lot of people who, notice my elbow is straight. In some cases it's too straight, but you'll see a lot of people who will do that. Okay, so they'll bend at the elbow, they'll extend through the spine. There are a lot of ways to get the extra ranges of motion. And usually people are not limited in 60 degrees unless there are, you know, our clients who never work out. But the point is, if your scap is always downwardly rotated, retracted, depressed, and it can't rotate up, you're not going to have full overhead motion. So again, even though you're doing an overhead press, you are not training joint variability because you're not allowing the scaps to do what they're really designed to do. Okay. Any questions on that? It's a similar example. It's not identical. Okay. I did do some illustrations. I don't really know why I've got the dancing skeleton guy. I just found him in Word and he dances, so I had to include him because it's kind of awesome. But he does, you can see his scaps. That's why I made him backwards. But one thing I want you to notice about the rib cage is it's round. So if you look at the shape, you have a concave convex relationship. So, you know, I've got these stupid triangles here. These are flat. You know, these are not multi-dimensional objects. But you can see in this picture on the left with this rib cage here, that as the scap goes overhead from this starting position to something like this ending position, it's going to rotate up and around. Okay, this is normal. As this happens, it's going to allow these arrows here are it's supposed to be a humerus here. Notice that this is a scap here on the right. Whoops. On the right that has not moved. So this is somebody who is stuck down in that retracted, depressed state, yet their arm is going overhead, and I made it a red arrow because it probably hurts. Okay, so there's all this gap that needs to be made up from something. And on the left here, you have a scap that actually rotates up and will allow good alignment between the scapula and the humerus, and the glenohumeral joint is going to be right around here. Again, these are stupid little illustrations, but they should give you an idea of what needs to happen when you overhead press. So packing is probably not a good idea. So if the scap remains in place, you're not going to experience that upward rotation. You're not going to be training your joints. You're not going to be getting that variability. You're probably going to be weaker. You're probably not going to have a great press. You may, a lot of strong people do, but at some point you're probably going to top off and not be able to get there. You know, and keeping in mind too, that another common thing that keeps the scaps in that retracted position is jutting the chest forward, is that extended position, the position we're taught that, you know, we look pretty in and this is great posture, is actually excessive extension, which is going to further encourage the retraction. So don't hear that retraction is bad, downward rotation is not bad. None of these things are bad. Things become bad when they limit your options and you don't want them limited, or if you have pain and you don't want pain. If you're into pain, then cool, no judgment. This is for you. So, you know, some things that you can think about doing, wall slides are a great activity. If you're not sure how to do those, look up Eric Cressy on YouTube. He's got a lot of really good tutorials. Evan Osar is another one who will take you through wall slides and will actually teach you how to keep the humerus on the glenohumeral joint. If you guys don't know who Eric Cressy is, he's one of the top people in the field. He works with pitchers, mainly baseball, but he works with a lot of pitchers. Really, really top level guy. He knows his stuff. He gets paid a lot of money to be really smart. So you should do what he says. So one thing that I want to point out You know, this is something that kettlebell training really focuses on a lot. You'll hear contract your lats, contract your lats, contract your lats. Nothing wrong with that. There are other really smart people. Stuart McGill is a big fan of contracting your lat. In a lot of cases, it makes sense. If you look at the, you know, the top is kind of missing here, but you have the attachment here and here. This is a really strong link between the upper and lower body. So from a stability standpoint, if you're trying to keep your spine rigid, this is awesome. But when you get into something particularly like pressing, you hear a lot of contract your lats or press with your lat. We need to understand that to some degree that is impossible, okay? Your lat does the exact opposite motion of your press, okay? Your lat wants to pull your arm down and in. There is something to the thought that the lat anchors the position, and that's something to consider. But it's not as straightforward as that. And why I wanted to pull this up is if you look at the two stars, you have the latissimus dorsi here, and you have the serratus anterior here. If you look at the serratus anterior, it's actually going underneath and around the rib cage. The serratus anterior is an upward rotator of the scapula. I really think that when a lot of people think they are contracting their lats, if they do it right, I really think they're contracting the serratus anterior. Because when I learned how to do that to push my scap and drive it into upward rotation when I pressed, I got a lot more strength. I had a lot more range of motion. This is just me speculating and talking out loud. I've never seen any studies on this stuff. But the argument for contracting the lats during the press is pretty much non-existent. I read a book that had some promise and it was really disappointing. So there's really limited application there. So I just wanted to point that out because that's something you will get in the kettlebell literature. Contract the lat, but it's really hard to truly contract the lat and still go overhead. So what we want to talk about is using the whole system. You know, when you get into kettlebell training, you've got squats, you've got hinges. A lot of people don't do squats because they're not heavy. You know, you can't load up with kettlebells what you can put on your back. So, you know, people kind of ignore them. But what you do get is an opportunity to drop the pelvis straight down between the feet. And Jeremiah is going to show you some of that stuff. With a back squat or a front squat, most conventional squatting, it's awesome. You can really move a lot of load, but it's going to change the angle of your torso. You're not going to be able to move the same way with the bar that you will be with a kettlebell. It's just biomechanically, it doesn't work. So, you know, each lift has its own advantages, but don't forget your kettlebell squats. Don't forget your presses. You know, swings and snatches and all that stuff are great, but you want to use the entire system, and you want to use it in a way that is going to really speak to what the joints actually want to do. You know, we could really spend hours and hours talking about this stuff. This is just two, you know, surface explanations of two joints. But if you really look at a lot of these movements, you know, dig into the anatomy sometime. Look and see what they actually do, how they're supposed to move. And, you know, when people say do it this way, you should ask why. The system is pretty good and it really doesn't need a lot of tweaking. But a lot of times we come to these things with our own preconceived notions, and we're really missing out on a lot of training opportunities. So that's it for my part. Jeremiah is going to go over some stuff now. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff I went over? It's subtle, and it may not seem like a big deal, but I think it actually is. If you don't agree, you're wrong.
I have questions.
What's up, Suki?
So when you're talking about nutation and counter nutation, I've actually been recently trying to understand this, and I cannot, about how your sacrum moves in relation to your pelvis, but we didn't even talk about the sacrum.
No, I think you may have come in late. I stepped on the terminology a lot. You know, with nutation and counter nutation, you're going to have, the way I understand it is you counter nutate the pelvis. You're going to have some opposite motions with the innominants. As the sacrum goes one way, the innominants are going to rotate slightly the other way. The thing is, though, where that's going to happen at the SI joints, it depends on who you believe. They really do not have a lot of motion. Most people put it at about 2 degrees. I've heard some renegade people talk about up to 30 degrees, but that's kind of 2 degrees here, and it was really creative math. So most people really give it about 2 degrees. So what happens if you really only have at the most 2 degrees of motion, the whole thing will end up orienting as a unit. So when the sacrum goes into nutation, so when the bottom, so if this is the top of your sacrum here, and so here's the bottom, here's the top. As the sacrum moves forward, the top of it moves forward. That's nutation. Technically, the innominates are going to move back, but they don't have that much motion to move. So the whole thing is going to orient as one thing. So nutation of the sacrum is going to really end up looking like an anterior tilt, and the sacrum, so counter nutation is really going to look more like a posterior tilt.
And then I was reading something about squat biomechanics, and maybe this isn't the right time to ask, but they're talking about in the first part of a squat that your innominates are exteriorly positioned, and then in the middle of the squat, then it's interior, and then at the bottom it goes exteriorly rotated again, and that was confusing to me also.
The problem with a lot of these studies, you know, we would really have to get into a lot of things to be able to talk intelligently about it. You know, is this person using an ideal stance? Is this person doing a back squat, front squat? What is the loading scheme?
No, she's talking about how your ISA is going to make certain parts of your squat more difficult. Like a wide will have a hard time getting to the bottom, and a narrow can get to the bottom, but they have a tricky part in the middle, and how it relates to your pelvic diaphragm.
Yeah, I would say some of that stuff is interesting. You are going to find that with so what she's talking about is infrasternal angles and infrapubic angles and the alignment of the pelvic and the abdominal diaphragm. Mm-hmm. These things seem to have an anatomical bias. Certain people who tend to be wider and certain people who tend to be narrower, and there tend to be certain phases of respiration in which we get stuck. So, you know, I would need to see, you know, specifically what's going on. Is this compensated? Is it non-compensated? But different people, a lot of it is just normal respiratory mechanics and what tends to happen. During certain phases of things. Send me an email, Suki, and I've got some stuff that I'll send you that kind of explains. It's a really good video that explains what happens at the innominates, at the sacrum, during certain phases of respiration, and what are the normal anatomical pairings that you can expect. But yeah, some of that stuff gets tricky. I'm really just interested right now in someone trying to have a more upright squat and a more upright pelvis, as opposed to, you know, really just sticking it out, because again, the hip joints are not going to experience the same thing.
Because I was trying to like get my squat to be more vertical, and then I realized my squat is hingy as fuck, and I cannot, no matter what I do, I elevate my heels and I can't like align it.
It could be respiration. It could just be your normal pattern. So like if you look at me and Jeremiah, he's wide. So he's 8'6", I'm 4'3". He's just a giant human being and I'm a tiny little man. So I have a little structure and I can squat. He can't. He actually looks pretty foolish and I make fun of him regularly. He hinges better than I do though, and he makes fun of me for that. So, you know, your anatomy is going to color it to some degree. But what I would say is I would need to personally take a look and see if maybe there's some sort of respiratory thing going on that's getting you stuck in a particular position. We're gonna have an anatomical bias whether we want to or not. So if you have an anatomical bias toward being wide, and a wide ISA, IPA is not, these people are not going to be good squatters naturally. It's just going to be something that you're going to have to fight against. So you'll probably be able to improve it, but it could just be an anatomical bias, and there's really not much you can do, except for maybe one of those weird Chinese bone surgeries. They're doing weird shit over there, like making themselves longer. So I don't know, maybe go there and see what you can do. But otherwise, I would say you just got to practice.
Okay.
Anything else?
No.
Jeremiah's going to show you some stuff that you can try. And a big part of this, the squat work you do, is exhaling. It's actually allowing the thoracic cavity and the pelvic cavity to align in a way that is going to allow more of your natural anatomical structure to come through. I've never met anyone who isn't compensated to some degree, especially people in our line of work who are actually athletic, because we're high strung and we move too much and usually do too much of the same thing. So anyway, I'm done talking unless there are more questions.
All right, I think we're good on questions. Again, if you have them, you can unmute and just pipe in, or you can drop them in the chat and I probably won't see them. All right, so hold on one second here. All right, cool. All right, so what we're gonna get into right quick is, I'm just gonna cover the squat today. I don't, like my favorite way to demonstrate some of that stuff with the press, I don't have the capabilities or the setup to do that for you now. But when it comes to the squat, we can take care of that. And bear in mind, I am, what Roger said was wide. I've been working on that in many ways by eating better and practicing my breathing, okay? So when it comes to that, my squat is a little bit different. So what I'm going to show you is some of the things that I do, and I know Roger does it. He even posted about it the other day to kind of get that squat, better essentially, so that I'm actually doing the squat. And I know Suki, you just mentioned that you're hingy as fuck, and that's all right. So am I. But basically, what we're gonna do is get it unhinged and allow some of that arch back to go away and allow some of those hip extensions to be better, okay? So just to give the visual, this is what Roger was talking about that anterior tilt and all that arch in the back, okay? Sexy Graham shit, okay? So if that's you, this might be very helpful for you. Some things to remember when we set up for the squat. I'm going to show it in a heels elevated position. That can be done a couple of ways. I have a half foam roller that I'm going to use. There are all kinds of ramps that you can get. If you have like some weight plates, you can do that, or a couple of Bibles will be fine, okay? Either way, any book or anything to elevate that is fine. What we want to emphasize is balancing the foot and making sure that our heel is doing the work. So when we do the squat, we want to go straight down. If you are shifting your hips back, that's a problem. If you're sitting forward all the way, tipping over, that's also a problem. But we do want the knees to push forward. Now, this may sound scary, and you may be worried, but Roger can attest, somebody who's had countless knee surgeries, I'm sure, from strange things he did in his youth, but it will not hurt your knees to go into this position typically. Now, if it does hurt your knees, by all means, stop and consult somebody. But what I'm going to show you hopefully will be a nice, clear path for you. Your knees are meant to bend all the way. So to get into that position, I'm going to start with the little lighter kettlebell. Hopefully I don't screw this up on the first time. So I'm going to be heels up. I'm going hip width apart. I'm choosing to do the side angle so you can see if I can make it vertical up and down, and you can see the slight posterior tilt. I'm going to create what I'm referred to as a stack, and this is going to be just kind of lining up that thoracic spine and all that with your pelvis to give yourself a nice, strong abdominal cavity so you can hold weight and you can breathe properly.
So
without going into
this is the thing we were talking about, the pelvic and the abdominal diaphragm. You've got to get those two things stacked. If you don't get them stacked, your respiration, your diaphragm is not going to allow the sacrum move. It's not going to allow anything really to happen. It's not going to allow your diaphragm to relax. You're going to stay in extension. So the stack and the ability to exhale here is super important. If you don't get the breathing right, you're not going to get the squat right.
Excellent. Yes, and if you want to dig deeper into this, there's so many layers to this, and it's very, very detailed. Check out, since we're dropping names here on this one, check out Zach Couples. He's the master at this right now, or somebody like Bill Hartman. They'll be able to get you squared away with even more details. So the exhalation is going to be key. I don't want to just stand here and drop into my squat and hopefully this is great. you know, because again, I have poor hip extension, so that leads me to believe that I am in a slight anterior tilt, which means when I stand in this full standing position, I'm not actually in a full standing position. My hips aren't fully extended. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna start with this in this goblet. I'm just gonna give myself an exhale, normal breath in. And as I exhale, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna essentially take and just give this the slightest tilt. Now, you don't have to be to the point where you're dumping it under like, yeah, this is what's up. Trust me, you don't wanna do that. That causes a lot of problems. It's just a slight exhalation. Now, you can also cure a lot of back problems with this as well. So I'm just gonna, that's about my exhalation. I don't know if you can see it here, but I did it. Another thing I want to do to kind of help create that space that I need to be able to brace properly is I'm going to take my elbows and I'm going to drive them down and forward. Now, when I do this, I don't want to just drop in the squat. I'm going to pull myself into it. The progression for this, I'm going to do this in a goblet, but if you can do this with a support, such as like holding onto a pole, if you're on a squat rack or something like that, or using a bar that's fixed, possibly even a TRX, but unlikely to be the best solution. You want to be able to control this isometrically and then load it up and move into movements, okay? So I'm gonna give it my exhale, driving down, and I'm gonna go straight down. I'm shooting my knees forward. Hopefully I'm going straight down. I'm maintaining that tuck, and as soon as I start to feel like I'm going to shift back, that's where I need to be. So I'm gonna practice, I'm gonna hold here isometrically. No pain, this feels really good. And I'm gonna stand up, okay? Now, you're gonna get some toasty quads when you do this, and essentially when we're doing our squat, we wanna get our quads involved, I would hope. That's why we do those. For all of those who do a million lunges to get ready for any competition or anything like this, this will help you get stronger quads as well. So if you can hold in the isolation, you're good to go. Now let's try and get in that full range of motion. Same scenario. My heels are planted. I'm on the elevation. I'm gonna exhale. Slight tilt. I'm pushing my elbows down and away. I feel my serratus firing, which is good. Trying to maintain upright position. Tell me if I shift back, Roger.
You look good so far. You look like you might poop a little bit, but you're in position.
Boom. Now,
there we go.
I've kept that tuck. My back is upright. I feel comfortable. I could be here all day. Unfortunately, if I am, I won't be able to get up, but I'm gonna go ahead and drive up, and hopefully I don't lose it here. And I'm up. Hopefully that was relatively straight up, straight down. If I wasn't, then that just means I need a little more practice on it. But I definitely fired my quads. I felt the full extension when I got to the top in my hips, and using my glutes. These are really kicking. I was really driving those down. So that will also help with my press. Right, Roger?
It will.
That being said, you may come across some issues getting into position. So if you are trying this out and you're still in this tilted position, chances are you haven't perfected the stack. Remember, it's an exhale and a slight tilt, turn under. A good cue is Roger told me this one, and it made all the difference in the world. I'm gonna find my belly button, I'm gonna find my pubic bone, and I'm going to just try to bring my belt buckle to my belly button, right? Just a slight little bit. Too much, you're gonna start to stress out these muscles in your lower back, and that's not good. So it's just slight. Vertically orienting yourself, meaning you're not hingy as fuck when you come down. So as you can see, I'm shifting back. Even though my knees are still a little bit forward over my toes, I'm not as vertically oriented. That goblet will probably help you with that. Loading the front, or something like a Zerzer squat or something like that. But because we teach kettlebells, I'm just telling you how to do it with the kettlebell, okay? If you're able to do this on the floor, great. I have not yet. I find it to be best with the heels elevated. But if you're able to try it on the floor and you still find yourself losing balance or not being able to maintain the position, usually elevating the heels will help. Finishing upright, again, making sure your stack is correct. Stack, load. I've got plenty of room to create the tension needed, to get the air needed, and using that weight to give me the balance will be where I'm going to find that ability to stay upright. You don't want to be dipping over. You can kind of look with your eyes a little bit. That might help you get up. If you're looking down, you're going to tend to fall forward. So just kind of keep them either straight ahead or maybe slightly up. And that's going to get you in that upright position. How this helps in the hinge is if we take it to what Roger said, and you have that anterior tilt and you're in that constant flex position, when you come up from there and you're still in that tilt, obviously you're not getting that full hip extension. So you're not getting a full extension in your swing or your deadlift or whatever. But if you don't get the full extension in your swing, you may not get all out of your glutes. It's just not going to be the best it could be. So knowing how to find that and then hinging back into that position, then going into your swing and standing up with that slight correction that you make is going to allow those hips to fully extend. Now, that is going to require some practice, I'm sure, as much of this will, but that's how you're going to get the benefit from that in your hinge. If you just stay in that position and you swing, you'll probably be able to swing, but you could do more, okay? You could get more out of your swing. You could develop with your squats in a huge way by doing them this way and build your overall strength. And like Roger said, this is different from like loading up with a front squat or a back squat. When I do my back squats, I'm very hingy because that's just the way I'm shaped. So it's going to be that hinge pattern in a pseudo squat. Whereas making this adjustment, I'm able to do the squat. My quads are getting the work they need to get to work. My back feels great from it because I'm not putting that stress, that anterior tilt, bunching everything up. Now, I will say that I did have a run-in with a slight back injury, and just by working my pelvis into this position through breathing and squats like this, it's virtually gone now. I'm not saying that that's going to cure everything for everybody, but I will tell you that just relieving some of those mechanical issues, this should help you in more ways than one. Did I miss anything, Roger?
No, you're good. Just something I want to point out is the idea of spinal substitution for both flexion and extension mechanics. So in the swing seminar, we went over this whole second hinge idea, or the spinal hinge. And when you are trying to go back, to maximum depth in your hinge, if you don't have that ability, you're going to fire that down to your spine. Okay, your spine is going to become a substitute for both flexion and extension. Now, you're also going to see this, and this is something he had a hard time with at first, is when you go into the tuck and you go into counter nutation, the tendency is going to be for a lot of people to move through your spine. So you're actually going to want to flex from the bottom. So that's the flexion from the bottom. That's not what we're after. And why we don't want that is, again, we're trying to teach the hip to do hip things, not in the pelvis to do pelvis things, and to not always use the spine. So this is something that will actually give you a little bit of a tweak. If you have a hard time doing that, then it's probably a clue that you are using your spine to substitute for flexion and extension. Not necessarily always a bad thing, but again, if you're using one joint regularly to make up for a lack of function in another joint, usually you're going to be more efficient and you're less likely to injure yourself if you can get efficiency. So another thing that I've been working on with my tucking is to actually think about pushing my pelvis straight down before I tuck. So just try to get as tall as possible, try and push the whole pelvis long toward the floor, and then just very, very subtly tucking underneath you should feel very lower deep abdominals doing this. And you should feel kind of, you should also feel some glute stuff going on too. But if you have a hard time getting into this position, it's probably a sign that you're using your spine to substitute for flexion and extension at the hip. So this could be something you need. And try your active straight leg raise when you do this. See what happens to your hamstring length. If someone feels like they've chronically got tight hamstrings, it may not fix it. I'm sure there are some cases where it wouldn't, but most people clean up pretty good as soon as they bring the pelvis back the other way, and then we recheck. That's all I got. Anybody have any questions?
Yes, I have a question. So I sometimes will do this exercise because I have a hard time posteriorly tilting and I'm stuck anterior. But when I go posterior tilting, my knees sometimes, like my kneecaps sometimes move around. So what should I just like limit range of motion so that way they can track properly?
You definitely, but probably, you're going to see as you start to change, you start to change one input in the system, you're going to have multiple things and multiple things moving. And one of the things that Suki was talking about is how certain phases of the squat you're going to see based on just the shape of things. You might see motion, internal versus external rotation, things like that. You may see some subtle movements. I would say in the beginning, limit your range of motion. Even practice your tucking in a supine or maybe even like a quadruped, like a rock back position, and then transfer it up. Because moving through the knee, I wouldn't worry about it at all. I'm sure a lot of that is normal and perfectly safe. But if you're pretty new to the movement, then I would limit it at first. Get really comfortable. You'll know when you feel things in the right position. You'll know when things are stacked. So once you start to trust that, then I would go through progress the position into squatting or something a little more advanced.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. Doing it in the supine position, getting comfortable and trying to figure out where your range of motion is and like how to get into that right position is going to be key. One of the ways that's been helpful to me to kind of reinforce like staying in that position through movement is I'll get in that position in quadruped and using the rock back as well as trying to maintain that in a bird dog position as well. And that's just been kind of helpful to cue in different ways and different body positions to understand and get used to being like that.
Even try, if you can get that tuck, try the tuck and a hinge, because that can make your glutes really toasty. If the tendency is when you go back into your hinge, if you're going into lumbar extension because you're running out of hip flexion, you might find that you have a lot of sensations in the glutes, the hamstrings that you just did not feel before. You will really realize the stuff you were using and the stuff you were neglecting. So the emphasis is we're looking to bring people back to neutral and maybe just slightly posterior. Okay, we're not looking to exaggerate, and this is where things in our industry go wrong. It's a lot of people are going to come away from this saying, "Oh, Roger said active straight leg raises are bad," and that's fine. I've been doing this long enough to know that people are going to get what I say wrong. We've got to get out of that thinking. Variability is really just about options. So if you do this stuff to the point, let's say you're stuck in nutation and you do this to the point where you can't get out, let's say you're counter nutated, that's also a problem. Variability is just about being stuck in a place you don't want to be. It's not even about being stuck in a place, because you may want to be stuck in that place. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of powerlifters really want to be stuck in their shitty positions because it helps them move more weight. That is their goal. So we don't want to go too far, but these are really, really subtle motions.
Subtle.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's subtle. So be careful before you load up and try and do a bunch of this stuff. Find your way unloaded first and make sure you're comfortable there. I can only just say that enough. And a fun thing, Roger kind of discovered this a few months back, and then I tried it and I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool. If you want to make your carries lighter and have your glutes work a little bit more, just get that little posterior tilt and then do your farmer carries, and you'll feel like these are nothing, and you'll certainly feel a bit more ab engagement and a bit more glute engagement as you do this.
And again, that just comes down to neutral. We don't realize the muscles we're using and the muscles we're not using until suddenly we find ourselves in a normal orientation, or let's say an anatomical orientation. And like a lot of people tend toward anterior tilt. It's just a lot of compensations, and that way, and most of us are compensated at some point. You know, it is what it is. So, any other questions? Okay, Suki, email me. I'll send you some links. Another thing too is if you guys have specific questions or topics that you want us to cover, please email us at whatever our email address is. I should know this, but I might not.
Or message through the InstaWeb or whatever.
That's better.
The email address. You get an email from us, so you got it, or you get a message. It's all. You can get a hold of us if you really want to know something. We are more than happy to help you out as best as we can.
But yeah, I would really enjoy doing, answering a bunch of questions and letting you guys know what it is you want to know. And what about the class? Are you
yeah, I mean,
who would be able to make it?
Yeah, we would like to do the class. And if you missed that when we started on, we wanted to do a class starting hopefully Saturday, and hopefully everybody can make it, but it seems like Saturday. So we've done Kettlebell Club, and it would be like 8 in the morning on Saturday. Essentially, it'd be this format. I would lead the class. Roger would be a coaching eye as well, since there's so many little tiny screens. And we would go through a workout and practice our skills based on some of the things we talked about. And, right now we're tossing around like an 8 a.m. on a Saturday would be ideal. I don't know how many people go out anymore. Hopefully none of you, but that would be ideal. We would like to charge $5 for this class, just to show some commitment to us, and fun. It'll be a solid time, and you will be better. And these will all be recorded, so if you miss it, you can follow along on your own time occasionally. So is anybody aside from Phyllis not able to do like a Saturday? Any interest in doing a class with us on Saturdays? Seems good.
I'm down.
All right, cool. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and if it's not too short a notice, I'll double check, and I'd like to start this Saturday. If it feels like too short a notice to any of you, for sure, next Saturday at 8 it'll happen. But we're ready to rock and roll, and we're certainly going to cover the swing and the press in this first class, and kind of get a gauge where everybody's at. And you'll hopefully discover more about what you can and can't do, and what you really need help with, or where you're really an all-star at. So that being said, again, thanks a lot for taking the time to learn with us. I know it's hard to focus on getting better sometimes, and especially when it's weird out, like 90 degrees. But thanks.
Here for the valley.
Yeah, I'm in a garage. I'm trying to figure out how to get a fan down here, but it's going to be next to impossible. But that's all right.
Good luck with that, brother.
No. I got 2 100-foot extension cables for plug-ins, so maybe that might be a solution.
Oh, snap.
I don't know, right? All right. But all in all, if there's no more questions, thanks again, everybody. And we'll see you on Saturday, and we'll see you next Thursday. And book it. Thursdays at 2, Saturdays at 8. If you can make it. If you miss it and you need the link, just message us, okay?
Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
All right. I see all y'all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Later.
Bye.
Okay. Should we call?